Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, Heading over to the next the panel, which will be dealing with propaganda and misinformation. And this panel will be chaired by Dr. Chengappa, who is an academic and journalist of repute. He has decades of experience in various facets of journalism. Dr. Chengappa was an associate professor at Christ University, Bangalore, and taught international relations along with strategic studies. Earlier, he was an editorial writer with Deccan Herald and specialized on national security issues and international affairs for 6 years. Dr. Chinkappa was a defense analyst with the Directorate of Net Assessment, Ministry of Defense, New Delhi. He has also worked as a senior research fellow with the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi, for 4 years. He was a special correspondent with the Indian Express newspaper in New Delhi, where he reported exclusively on military matters and national security issues. He has also logged 2.5 years with the Hindu Business Line in Bangalore, where he reported on defense industry and military R&D matters. He holds a PhD degree in Indian foreign policy towards China in the post-Nehru period and a master's in defense and strategic studies from the Madras University. Over to the brilliant chair for the next session, Dr. Chengappa. Please take over, sir.
Thank you, Commodore Venugopal, for that nice introduction. Am I audible? Bala, am I audible?
Perfect, you're audible, sir.
You're audible.
Thanks again, Commodore Venugopal. We have a very interesting session on propaganda and misinformation. Now, whether it's a communist country, authoritarian regime, or democracy, I have come to understand that propaganda and misinformation is part and parcel of modern day governance. All governments tend to practice propaganda and misinformation, and probably China has a very different environment to practice the same thing. The word propaganda comes from, actually is associated with the Christian church to propagate the word, the gospel of God. But over time, propaganda has come to mean something else. It's to provide a narrative, a favorable, just to sort of highlight favorable impression. In modern times, to make it very contemporary, the way that the Chinese media started accusing the United States of spreading the pandemic is the height of propaganda. And propaganda is nothing but an art of downplaying, negative news. Now, very interestingly, as Professor Naresh Rao mentioned earlier, my colleague, the Chinese state uses Facebook and Twitter to communicate to the outside world, but it does not permit these social media within China. So basically, propaganda and misinformation is to make sure that the media aligns with the ruling party. Even in India, there's innumerable cases of propaganda. It'll become very controversial to talk about all this, but let's leave it at that. And I will go ahead and introduce the panelists of the day who are going to speak on the subject. One is my good friend, Mr. Satyamurthy, who's a veteran journalist, political and foreign policy analyst. He has been the head of the Chennai initiative of the Observer Research Foundation, the multidisciplinary Indian public policy think tank headquartered in New Delhi since the former's establishment in December 2002. Presently, he is a student of Indian politics and foreign policy, as also India, Maldives, Sri Lanka, and the shared Indian Ocean neighborhood, with particular reference to their domestic politics, bilateral and trilateral relations, and interdependent dynamics. He has written extensively on these and related subjects, authored books, and participated in national and international seminars and contributed chapters and papers. Then we are supposed to have Mr. Paneer Selvan, who's the reader's editor of The Hindu and the executive director of Panos South Asia. Apart from being a regular columnist, he is also a journalism teacher and is an adjunct faculty of the prestigious Asian College of Journalism, Chennai. With wide experience in both print and television journalism, he is a board member of the Organization of News Ombudsmen and Standards Editor representing Asia. He was a fellow of Reuters Journalism Fellowship Program in the University of Oxford in 1998. Earlier, he served as the steering committee member and vice chair of the Global Forum for Media Development between 2005 and 2018. I'm not sure at what point he'll come in. And then I'd like to introduce Dr. Philip Jah, who has a very interesting profile. Dr. Jah is currently an assistant professor at the Times School of Media and Liberal Arts, Bennett University of the Times of India Group. He teaches journalism to media students and offers an open elective entitled Inside China, an Indian Perspective to engineering, management, and law graduates. He last worked as a China specialist with the BBC, where he covered China's annual parliament session and the Sino-US trade war, among other topics. Dr. Tilak has also worked previously with the Shanghai Daily and the All India Radio. Dr. Jha was an Asian Future Leaders Scholar of the Hong Kong-based Ban Xian Foundation between 2014 and 16. He's written very widely. And I'd like to then introduce the other speaker today, or panelist, Dr. Ejaz Wani. Dr. Wani is a research fellow at Observer Research Foundation, Mumbai. He is currently working on the project Kashmir Conflict, Managing Perceptions and Prospectus for Peace. Designed in the form of questionnaires and surveys with key stakeholders, the project is based on the Kashmiri youth perspective. Wani also tracks the minorities of China, Uyghur, radicalization in Pakistan, and Greater Central Asia. He is widely published in international and national peer-reviewed journals. He has received fellowships from Xinjiang Social Science Academy in Urumqi, Xinjiang, and the University Grants Commission in New Delhi. Wani is also a EUCAIS fellow, where he undertook a 2-year program, the European Union and Central Asia in the international system. So on that note, I will request Mr. Satyamurthy to make his presentation, and after about 10 minutes, I'll inform him that it's half time to make sure we regulate time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Commodore Watson, for asking that question of Ambassador Bambawale, the former Foreign Secretary. That is ripped off my tongue, so to say. Most speakers here and others talk about the coverage of Chinese newspapers, the credibility of Chinese newspapers, etc., or Chinese media per se. I think I will take a look at the credibility of the Indian media vis-a-vis foreign policy matters and why and how of it. See, I'm sorry to say that over the last 10 years in particular, Indian journalists, analysts, and policymakers to an extent, particularly veteran policymakers, have conferred certain credibility on global times vis-a-vis Chinese policies. But we refuse to give that kind of confer that kind of a credibility on the Indian media. Of course, a section of the media is also to blame for that side, that part. But over the last 5 to 7 or 8, 10 years, a concerted effort has been made within the country to discredit our own reputed media institutions. With the result, we do not have a system, we do not have a source to communicate with our own people, two-way street, particularly. I would say that for us, the media per se has a few basic work to do. One is, of course, sharing information. Two, providing editorialized views on issues. providing multiple analysis from different angles by different experts, and then communicating between, being a tool of communication between the policymaker, the government, the political leadership, and the people for whom it is meant. I'm not going to talk much about the Form 3, but in the last department, I think we have suffered a lot because, say, from the days of Mahatma Gandhi, I'm going back to about 100 years, or Jawaharlal Nehru, or Indira Gandhi, or the present day, leaders have a tendency to go over institutions, particularly when they are too popular, to reach out their message to the masses or the consumer, whether it is elite or non-elite or villager. That's as much good in terms of foreign policy as with domestic policies, domestic issues, etc. Here, the one problem is when the question of credibility of incumbent leadership or a past leadership comes into the mind of the masses or the people to whom they are addressed, those issues are addressed, then it becomes difficult to carry the people with you. This, I think the policymakers and politicians need to take note of. That's not happening. So there was a time when journalists, media analysts, or even those working in policy think tanks, veteran staff in the strategic community, they had access to information. They had access to the policymaker or the government leadership, political leadership, where there was an exchange of views. I think over the last several years, this one aspect has been lost. So, what you read in one newspaper is what you read in every newspaper, which is a government handout. In such a situation, I don't know where we are. It is also even appropriate for us to say, China, there is no flow of information from the government to the same people to the government, etc., because that's what's happening in almost every country across the world today, including India. So once that happens, the role of the media becomes suspect and even frivolous to talk about the role of media in foreign policy making. But the fact is, such an opportunity used to remain. It is still open for us to correct the problems and go forward. Yes, as we know, media has access to multiple leaders, multiple sources. It is not that the government doesn't have, but people do open up. From what little I have learned in the last 30, 40 years of my journalist policy analyst roles, people do open up freely to non-government people. And the more you build a line of personal communication and credibility, greater are the chances of you being able to extract information and even something that they may not want to tell in a press conference or even their counterpart leaders or policymakers. This kind of an environment needs to be created. That is lacking in this country, and it is slowly but steadily declining. So in a crisis time, this is going to have a huge impact on the public perception of the government. Recall what happened to the government of India's credibility inside the country after the Chinese War of 1962. Until then, most of the government, most of the media was singing praise of the government leadership, etc. But with a difference, at the time, even at the height of the war, Parliament was openly discussing these issues. Let's say war issues on a daily basis. Parliament was in session, or in times when it was in session. there was no hesitation to communicate with the people, communicate with the parliamentarians. One. Two, we are living in this world where the role of the traditional media is shrinking and that of the social media has increased. The problem with the social media, it started up by killing the credibility of the traditional media. It successfully did it. Today, the credibility of the social media is also suspect, or rather, it doesn't exist. So the problem with today's media, as I see, there's a huge gap in credibility, whether it is in the coverage of domestic issues or of foreign issues. And having traveled to some of the South Asian countries, I have seen some of the national TV channels used to be heard not only by politicians, but even the common man in far off places, in small villages, to know what is happening in India. Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood policy, as you know, it's about neighbors and their people. But long before we evolved this policy, there were neighbors in small villages in Sri Lanka. These are two countries I know, like the back of my hand, or Maldives, in small islands. Whenever an English channel news came up, the men would grab the TV remote from their wives who will be watching only top Indian ZTV and other TV channels, soap operas, to watch English TV news channels. Yeah, that is what they thought of India. Our future, our life, our security, everything is linked to that of India's. But today, no thanks to the credibility gap we created for our media, there is a huge credibility gap about India in these countries. So how to repair that is for the government or the institutions and the establishments, both of the media and of the government and political parties, to build. That has to happen. If or now a little late. But if you cannot avoid and have a session or panel discussion on media and foreign policy, because we have to influence. Right? But for instance, take any of the analysis on any foreign policy issue emanating in the Indian media in the last 5-10 years, definitely the particular after the Chinese aggression. Has anyone said anything new or exclusive? In the sense, see, I am not talking about facts that you may know that I don't know which code. That again is not happening. Everyone is reprinting a handout of the government, which is good in wartime. We definitely have to stand by the government, and your reader is not going to like it also, or reader or viewer, if you are going to try to act smart. But going beyond that, all the analysis on China, foreign policy, Chinese policy, or the incursions, they are all dated information dating back to 50 years, 60 years. Or we talk about what US has to say of China, not what our government has to say of China, or what our government should be knowing of China from an Indian perspective, Indian state perspective. Right? Likewise, the former foreign secretary said another thing about, in answer to Commodore Watson's question, about strategic.
Mr. Satyamurthy, 10 minutes more, 5 minutes more.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it was originally 20 minutes.
Yeah. So you finished 15 minutes. Huh?
No. Okay. Because you said 10 minutes, that's not an issue at all. Okay. As the former foreign secretary said about strategic this thing, right? And He also defended what is India's interest should take precedence over strategic autonomy. I would say strategic autonomy and national interest are one and the same to an extent. But again, the problem here is, as Commander Vasan rightly asked, has the government, policymakers, taken the nation into confidence? As someone who was closely watching the economic reform process, the leadership of the day built a national consensus, right? From 1989-90 onwards, behind the scenes and in the front, after the Narasimha Rao government came to power, the effort was made to build a national consensus, which is what has survived today, till date. No government that came after then have tried to, they may be tweaking it. They have not dumped it. Likewise, even without it, so when it comes to our foreign policy, particularly our policy towards China or Pakistan, no government is going to change it overnight in any distant future, particularly without consultation and the advice of the defense forces, MEA, and other agencies of the government who know these things better. Still, in matters of perception, I think it is time we created a national consensus first. How are we going to move forward? Only then a media policy or a media's credibility, media's use in terms of building up an foreign policy approach or helping in the foreign policy of the nation will help. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Satyamurthy.
Yes.
Can we have the next speaker coming in? Will Mr. Philip Jah speak? Can I ask Philip Jah to take the floor?
Yeah, I can start. Thank you, sir, for inviting me, and thank you, Chennai Center for China Studies, for giving me the invitation to speak today. As far as the topic, media and propaganda in China is concerned, it's a lot has been said since the sessions, in the different sessions today, and I think what we need to figure out possibly is how to go about it, and possibly get into the more detail of it is as in how they actually work. So in brief, I think if we just observe what has been happening over the past 5 years during in China, as far as the media is concerned, there are so many, we all know that there are sensitive issues which they have, and it's not just for the foreign audience, it's also for the domestic audience. And the way they control it, they have been sharpening their methodologies to basically censor things, to make sure that, well, they are in line with the propaganda, which is, they are in line with public opinion. I think that is one of the key concerns with the Chinese Communist Party has been following since very beginning, in the sense that while they do propaganda, they try to be in sync with the public opinion. I think if you just take a look at what are the, I think they are not made public per se, but whatever the circulars which are issued by the propaganda department to the media agencies or to the journalists, they're essentially to make sure that, well, fine, we do propaganda, but at the same time, we be in sync with the public opinion, be it by censoring, be it by molding it, or be it by, giving a different shape. So, for example, let's take the case of one of the most sensitive words in China, Tiananmen. Now, whenever there is a 4th June situation, they will always try to censor it. They have been doing it for years now, since 1989. I think, so I think whenever this anniversary is around, the words like Liu Se, which is like 6-4, short for 4th of June, those terms suddenly vanish away. And I think not just that, actually, there will be many combinations of these things, the images, people who are good with internet, they try to circumvent these things with so many things, but I think the censors have been catching up. And I think that at least they have been, in recent years, with the government almost hell-bent on getting things not beyond its control, they have done a fairly good job as far as censorship is concerned. So, for example, if it is anything around 4 June, then at least there are reports that, well, even a shoe being sold in RMB 46 or a Bluetooth speaker being sold for $46 or $64, even all these very visibly innocuous terms can also face censorship. And not only that, doesn't apply for individual citizens, that also applies for party papers. For example, there was this China Youth Daily, which is the Communist Party's on one of its own newspapers. They filtered one news about 46 people dying in Yangtze River because of the boat capsizing. So you see, the amount of sensitivity can be really, really significant. It has somehow, with the power struggle going on in China, it's northward. And so this is interesting. By the way, what they have done in recent years, as far as Tiananmen is concerned, that they're trying to, they do realize that, well, they cannot, not entirely sanction anything related to Tiananmen. They need to possibly mold it. So what they have started doing in recent years is that they have started encouraging netizens to talk about Tiananmen in a positive light. For example, there is this Jie Fangchun Pao, which is the People's Liberation Army newspaper. What they started doing is that they had this military parade on 9th of September a couple of years ago, in 2015 to be around 2015. And after that, they started pushing people to use 3.9 Tiananmen Square military parade hashtag. These kind of hashtags essentially, especially the younger generation, the netizen generation, to feel linked with Tiananmen for a different purpose. So you see, there's a very creative way in which the Chinese censors work as far as molding and remolding and reshaping the public propaganda is concerned. And of course, they're not just limited to censorship. They have different means to target it. For example, there was this website called Wuqie Xinwen, whose Chinese translation translates to News Without Borders. It was a website around 2015 again. And this website, somehow, it so happened that it published one letter, which was published in international media, Chinese language international media, which called for President Xi Jinping to resign. And of course, there was a lot of controversy. The journalist faced jail, and from the next day itself, the newspaper started publishing exclusively communist propaganda. And of course, it's not just that, well, they were forced to do it. It's a state control, not just through propaganda department rates, but it's also through different means. For example, in this Wuqie Xinwen, the investment came from Alibaba. The investment came from an affiliate of the Xinjiang provincial government. Caixin which is another very, very famous independent financial magazine, that happened to be one of the investors. So the further investment to this website suddenly came to a halt. So there are financial means as well to control it. It's not without reason that the Chinese media is sort of very tightly controlled. It's not just a control, political control. It's an economic control. It's related to your job security. It's related to physical security. So it's a multiple levels of control where they ensure that, well, the control doesn't get out of control, if I may use it. So you see, and I think beyond that, they have done it more creative ways apart from that as well. For example, what they have been doing is that they have been trying to promote symbolisms related to Communist Party. For example, this long march related things. So of course, it's a huge thing in which in the Communist Party history, where thousands of people trekked across inhospitable terrains in their struggle against the nationalist forces, and of course, so it's a huge thing. And around those events, the Chinese media goes into a saturation coverage sort of thing, and they would just go gaga over it. It will simply be highlighted so much so that, well, it becomes almost like, well, there's nothing else. So there are different ways in which they have been censoring, such as this. And another example of this control, the way in which Chinese media tries to control, is through going abroad as well. And this is not just for domestic audience, it's also for foreign audience. The goal is always the same. For example, I think there is this we would have heard this famous Tankman photo about the Tiananmen. Now this Tankman photo has got certain copyright. Now what happened in 2016 was there is this Chinese company by the name of Visual China Group. They somehow acquired acquisitioned the Microsoft Picture Bank, and then they had this right of Tankman photo. Now, of course, they were concerned that whether they will be limiting their distribution. But at the same time, there are other aspects to it. For example, that company also had the copyrights of pictures such as Albert Einstein's famous tongue photo. I'm sure that everybody would remember that photo in which Einstein is putting his tongue out. Photos of Marilyn Monroe, photos of Audrey Hepburn. Now, all these photos. Now, for example, suppose if I'm running a media company and I need these photos, then I'll enter into a partnership with that Chinese company which is owning these copyrights. And there's a fine. We'll let you use other photographs only if possibly you do not publish this photo. That sort of becomes a different ball game altogether, which is, I think, a situation. It's not just happening in media domain; it's happening in technology domain. It's happening almost in significantly in other domains as well. And of course, we would have also heard about China's efforts to become Chinese media's efforts to become bigger and more popular. How much they are becoming successful is a different debate altogether. But they have been trying very, very hard. There is significant investment coming in. For example, in last year, they formed this Voice of China by combining this China Central Television, China National Radio, and China Radio International. Now, and they have been putting significant investment in this. So you see, these are different kinds of efforts. And of course, there is a significant. There has been. Not much is left now, but there has been a significant section in Chinese media which we consider to be independent. That's Haijing, the one which is Xinwen that I talked about right now, was an important one. So, for example, this independent media under Xi, it has gone on a relatively very, very severe. It's facing a survival crisis. Investigative journalism is almost entirely gone. So these things. But then I think there have been years in between, towards the turn of the century before Xi came in particular, which has been very, very significant in independent media space, including in the cyber domain. But then I think that what the state media does is that again plays creative characteristic game where they make sure that they lose their credibility. For example, there was this incident about about this Islamic State group which published a jihadist anthem in Mandarin language. Now, the state media didn't publish it. The independent media published it. And then the state media jumps over it and starts criticizing independent media. And the fact is that censors can censor that news as well, but they would not censor it because they believe that, well, independent media will anyway latch up on it. They'll publish it because they're hardly anyway. They don't have much scope to publish. And after that, the state media criticizes it. So you see, they let things out of control and they let things in, and of course in different ways they make sure that, well, the state media actually remains credit worthy inside China, and which is what by the way they're trying abroad as well. They have not received much success, but inside China this is working fine. And one very important thing that they have been, especially after Xi again, they have been almost taking it up with a mission mode, is that making sure that celebrities fall in line, the big names fall in line. We had heard about what happened to Jack Ma recently, and after that, we'll possibly hear more about Jack Ma for wrong reasons. Something like this happened with a famous Chinese actress called Fan Bingbing, who did a very, very famous role in a serial on one of China's few female strong rulers, Wu Meinyang. And she was somehow, there were some tax issues which was said to the public, but there were some other issues, political issues, and effectively they ended up, she almost vanished. And this is happening with almost like, it's almost like happening like a pattern. So there is a pattern to it. So you just criticize the party or its leadership, and then things happen. So we have a history of such things happening, and we also have a history of dissent, by the way. But of course, the state has prevailed so far. So whether it be activists, religious figures, human rights lawyers, they get jailed, they get deported. All these things keep happening, and this happens while at the same time, president and the party remains at the top of it. So this is the situation. I think what we also need to look into is how possibly I think this game is played in the foreign shores. Now, in foreign markets, again, what they do is that there's a game of deliberate confusion. So, for example, I think what we know for sure is that almost if you just make sure that the platform or the news portal is discredited, then even if they say the right thing, the people will be susceptible to not trusting it as much as earlier. So this is the kind of deliberate confusion that the Chinese and the Russian media has been often accused. But I think the one panel has already pointed out this is in democracies as well. This has become sort of something which is pretty almost taken as granted. This is an unfortunate situation, but that is how it has been working. There are cases of selective reporting. For example, in India's case as well, we had this report in September 2020 about which were published in the Indian Express about this overseas key information database, which had almost 10,000 Indians being monitored. Indian media might have forgotten it, but the fact is that they are still being monitored, and maybe more people have joined that list of monitoring. So you see, this Chanhua data information technology company, the initiatives such as this, it's a part of Chinese state structure. It's a part of Chinese media structure of going abroad, controlling foreign propaganda and controlling media rhetoric on the foreign shores. And this is very, very dedicated. The way China works over the years, I think this is substantial. At times it's benumbing to imagine an entire country working in one direction like this. Well, it seems to be very motivated. Possibly this is the reason why the progress in China has been very, very substantial. But at the same time, for the way we have seen the world, where you do things, you learn from it, I think that way the Chinese media propaganda suggests a very, very frightening situation. It's not just media is happening. It's happening through partnerships. The Chinese diplomats jump over, defending in a state. Chinese trade treaties are used. Things that are happening in Australia, things which have been happening with several other countries over those countries who opposed or sort of supported any contradictory views against China on COVID-19 or about any other issue.
Dr. Jah, you've got about 3-4 minutes left.
Okay.
3-4 minutes.
So you see, on almost Huawei, South China Sea, we have a whole lot of situation where China's countries which are in friction with the world find themselves into a very difficult scenario. I think I would like to wrap it up. There's a lot to say about it, but I think so the question arises that how to counter Chinese propaganda. Now, this is a very, very key question which we need to figure out. And the first thing that we need to understand is that you cannot counter Chinese propaganda, without developing the ability to counter China per se. And you cannot counter China if you do not have hard power and you do not have soft power at the same time. Now, this is something that we need to understand very well. There cannot be either or approach either to this, not with China at least. You cannot counter China with any piecemeal, stopgap, ad hoc approach. You need to get organized. And you need to also understand that you cannot counter a lie which is told 1,000 times just by telling truth once. You possibly need to match the Chinese propaganda at the same time. So these are the contours in which we need to understand Chinese journalism, and the Chinese journalism is propaganda by all count, and it is using all approaches to sort of propagate CCP's influence, the Chinese leadership's domination, and China's domination, of course. And at the same time, you also need to understand that if we do not do anything, then it's not going to be easy. It's going to get difficult over a period of time, and ultimately it will fire with a boomerang. So what to do? No, the first and most important thing that we need to understand is that hard power. We need to get economy, we need to get technology leadership, we need to get military leadership, and not just this. You need to get high tech in all of this. High level of economy, high level of technology, high level of military. You need to get all of this. Hard power would be very, very important in making sure that you are able to counter China and in turn Chinese propaganda in somehow. In terms of soft power, of course, you need soft power, not just the way Chinese do it, but getting more creative than this. In the sense that you beat China by using in its own game, but at the same time you do not forget who you are. That is very, very important. So I think for example, I think one very important suggestion, and I think one very important thing that the government possibly needs to pick up, and we need to pick up as people as well, is that people-to-people exchanges with other countries. Education, I think education is a huge opportunity where if you talk to the African and students or students from different parts of the world, they're willing to come to India, but the fact is we do not have cities which are livable. We do not have universities which can accommodate these students and provide quality education. We have law and order issues. We have basic issues. I think we just need to these basic things in place, and soft power. It's already we have. Despite all of this, we have significant soft power. We need to get all these things, and I think then it will be very much possible. And if we are able to do all of this, then of course I think the country of the size of India can take up a multi-pronged fight with China and target. It's almost making target things which are also indispensable for China, and that is where we need to up our game and of course counter China through propaganda means as well. I think that is. I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jah. That was a very nice, interesting presentation. I'd now like to invite Dr. Ejaz Wani to take over and make his presentation.
Yeah, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Satyamurthy sir knows better how I am handling the internet in Kashmir because I am from Kashmir. Currently, I am in Kashmir. So, my topic is today media handling of human rights and minorities in China. Now, when we see human rights, it can be traced back in history from Magna Carta to French Declaration of Human Rights and American Bill of Rights. But even in Asian context, when we see Persian Empire and Mauryan Empire, there were certain established principles of civil rights, and there were religious documents, for example, Vedas, Bible, and Quran. They have some sort of duties, rights, and responsibilities to the citizens. And when after the Human Rights World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, that crucial stage in United Nations policy in the field of human rights changed, and the Vienna Declaration encouraged the United Nations to pursue and strengthen its activities to make respect for human rights a priority objective on the same level as development and democracy, and to work for the concurrent achievements of these three objectives. However, a recent survey of the Amnesty International, the highest organization of human rights, the poll conducted by Amnesty International in America shows that only 8% of the adults and 4% of the youth in United States are aware of the foundation stones for human rights. So, the media plays a critical and statutory role in creating larger awareness of concept of human rights, basic human rights that would constitute the right of every individual to his fundamental freedom, without distinction on race, sex, language, religion, ethnic group, blah, blah, blah. Media today plays a decisive role in the development of society. Thus, the role of media in protection of human rights cannot be ignored or minimized. Media is a communicator of the public. So media can play a major role not only promoting the human rights, but also protecting the human rights. It can make people aware of their rights, of certain values, and which are the internal value of mankind. The media can perform role in different ways. It can make people aware of their rights, expose its violations, focus attention on people and areas in the need of protection of human rights, and pursue their case till they achieve them. Now, when we come to China, and it is media, because I have divided it, media within China, how they deal with human rights of minorities, and global media, especially the media in Europe and America and Japan and even in India, how they deal with human rights and minorities of China, how they write about them. The human rights situation in China is continued to be marked by systematic crackdown and on dissent among the minorities. Even the justice system remains largely plagued by unfair trial, torture, and other ill treatment in detention. China still classifies information on its extensive use of death penalty as a state secret. Even to me, China did not recognize human rights of any ethnic group living in there. However, given the economic prowess of Beijing from last 2 or 3 decades, China was recently appointed to influential UN Human Rights Council panel in April 2020. As Chinese human rights record whether they recognize the human rights or not, the appointment has sparked concern about the future of United Nations human rights agenda, and even some questioned the United Nations also. How could it is possible that a country which one does not know whether they recognize human rights or not, how could they become the member of this influential human rights body at UN? Now, coming to minorities, they have used it after 2001, especially when I was in China in 2014, especially in Xinjiang for 8 months. When I visited Khotan, the prefecture adjacent to Kashgar, when I went there, when I was coming back, and police officials stopped me, take my camera, and deleted all the images, and even searched my laptop and deleted all the images for it from my hardware. So this is how they deal with external individuals who are from other countries. Internally, they have started repression in the use of anti-separatism or counter-terrorism after 2001. That remained particularly severe in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and Tibetan populated area, that is Tibet. Authorities have subjected Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and other predominantly Muslim ethnic minorities in Xinjiang to intrusive surveillance, arbitrary detention, and forced indoctrination. For it, China has rigorously censored all its media, from print media to online games, with assistance of private technology, especially for Huawei and other technological giants and internet companies. Officials mastered the use of facial recognition, real-time registration system, and big data to keep people under indiscriminate mass surveillance and control. To keep the censorship rigorous, now see how CCP changed the things. To keep the censorship rigorous, especially on human rights, when it comes to human rights of minorities or majority group harms. In July 2019, in July 2019, a draft regulation on China's social credit system proposed punishing citizens for disseminating information that violates social morality or cause adverse social impacts. In January, Chinese users reported that they had been threatened, detained, or warned for being active on Twitter, a social media platform officially banned in the country. China also extended its control of cyberspace beyond its Great Firewall by launching powerful malware and denial of service attacks against overseas servers, websites, messaging apps deemed problematic. In Xinjiang, from 2016, detention of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other predominantly Muslim minority groups continued despite the government's claim that it may eventually phase out purported vocational training centers, also known as transformation through education system. From early 2017, after the Xinjiang government had enacted a regulation of enforcing so-called de-extrification, and estimated up to more than 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other ethnic minority people were sent to these internment camps. Even religious figures, intellectuals, academicians were detained in Xinjiang merely for exercising their right to freedom of religion and expression. That includes Ilham Tohli, an Uyghur economist, writer, and professor who was sentenced to life in prison in 2014, and Tashpol Tiyap, a former president of Xinjiang University, who was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve in 2017, both on charges of separatism. Given this rigorous policy, all the media in China is owned by CCP. So, we will never see any reference of human rights, even of the majority group, that is Han's. So, given this thing, the human rights record of China remains most vulnerable because nobody knows what is happening in China. The state is having so much control on its own media, nobody knows what is happening. For that purpose, some of the countries, especially Muslim countries, have helped China in some way or other way to save Beijing from global embarrassment when it comes to human rights violation. For example, after the re-education campus came into being in media somehow, in 2019, 22 Western countries, including Japan and United Kingdom, condemned China's actions in Xinjiang and wrote a joint letter to United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to act against the repressive policies of CCP. Now, Beijing swiftly denied the allegations and defended the re-education campus as vocational training centers designed to fight terrorism and combat Islamic extremism. On the very next day, as if on cue, 37 countries, mainly comprising Muslim nations, include Pakistan, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, Egypt, Kuwait, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, issued a joint letter commending China's efforts in protecting human and promoting human rights through development. The envoys of these countries wrote, the past 3 consecutive years has seen not a single terrorist attack in Xinjiang, and people there enjoy a stronger sense of happiness, fulfillment, and security.
Dr.
Now,
Dr. Vani,
yes,
you have about 5 to 6 minutes left. Thank you.
yes, sir. I will do in 7 minutes. Now, most of the Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, Malaysia, Iran, to offshore line of Beijing because of the economic prowess and the finances it provided to these Muslim countries. For example, Imran Khan, in an interview with Al Jazeera in September 2019, described China as Pakistan's best friend and finged ignorance about the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So, it is how China is using other authoritative, or I would say, who are not having good human rights record when it comes to Pakistan, what is happening to Baloch people, or when it comes to Iran. China is using them to toe to his line and have some impact on the global platform. Now, where from the human rights violation news came to global media houses? After 2017, most of the global media houses, especially the global south, highlighted the human rights violation among minorities in Xinjiang after news of more than 1 million people were interned in re-education camps. As most of the media outlets did not have any direct access to these volatile minority regions when it comes to Xinjiang and Tibet. They use Uyghur exiles living in other parts of the globe, the work of some academicians and think tanks to highlight human rights violations done by CCP. As for example, Adrian Zeg is a German anthropologist and sinologist known for his studies of the Xinjiang re-education campus. Adrian Zen is a senior fellow in China's studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, Washington, D.C. He has played a leading role in analyzing the leaked Chinese government documents to include the China cables and Karkash list. The global media uses his references to highlight the human rights violation in Xinjiang especially when it comes to Muslim minorities. His recent policy paper, Coercive Labor in Xinjiang, Labor Transfer and the Mobilization of Ethnic Minorities to Pick Cotton, was published by Center of Global Policy. It is a policy paper that was reproduced all in the global media outlets to highlight the human rights violations in Xinjiang and the forced labor. Even some of the Indian media outlets, especially the Hindu, also you reproduce the work of Zen Erdizin to give some sort of news about what is happening in Xinjiang when it comes to human rights violation. To me, it is the economic progress of China that Beijing is using to change the narrative of certain Muslim countries as well as some authoritative countries to keep his stronghold on the global forums. It was not possible that China could have been given a seat in United Nations Human Rights Council even after the gross human rights violations when it comes to minorities of Xinjiang as well as Tibet. Thank you, sir. It is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ejazwani, for sticking to your time. I must take this moment to thank all the three speakers, Mr. Satyamurthy and Dr. Philip Jah and Ejazwani. The question that comes to my mind is the old expression synonymous with China, namely the bamboo curtain, which was in vogue till the 1970s, which highlights the political and ideological barrier that separates China from the Western world or the rest of the world. How much has that changed today? The Chinese media is very inscrutable. The Global Times is a different cup of tea meant for an external audience and to test opinions, as earlier speakers pointed out. And Mr. Satyamurthy said there is nothing worthwhile in the Indian media here and there about the 1962 war. And Philip Jah, with a lot of hands-on experience of China, having lived in China, worked in China, added to the proceedings with his insights and perspectives. And Dr. Ejazwani shared with us his personal experiences and some anecdotal statements about minorities and media censorship in China and minorities.
Yeah, Dr. Vani, I think that was an excellent presentation. In addition to the two other presentations that were made, we in C3S did request the president in exile of East Turkestan to come and share his views about it. And it was on similar lines. Now, how effective would this be to call Xinjiang as East Turkestan and sell that idea? Because the message has not been received by the rest of the world. While we acknowledge that it was East Turkestan and was taken over by China by force, today there are not many people who are even aware of this. So what, in your opinion, is being done to address this issue of bringing about greater awareness?
Yeah, thank you. See, when we see the history of Eastern Turkestan or Xinjiang for that matter, even today, even it was recognized by Mao and his wife. He said them that they are aliens. And secondly, when we see the checkered history of Xinjiang or Eastern Turkestan, it was never ever till 1978 when its name was changed from Eastern Turkestan to Xinjiang. It was never a wholly and solely part of China. It was, most of the times, it was ruled by Khanates of Central Asia. And it is, to me, it was purely colonialization after 1978, when two of the administrators stressed that we should recapture Xinjiang, Eastern Turkestan, and in 1978, when Yaqub Beg was killed, they changed the name. It is a discourse which is happening in Eastern Turkey, which is happening in academia now, whether we should call it Xinjiang or Eastern Turkestan. Even In my PhD thesis and even in other papers which I have written so far in Xinjiang, I have used the term Eastern Turkestan, named by China Xinjiang in 1978. They are, most of the Uyghurs who are living in exile, they are using the term Eastern Turkestan. Even I have so many friends, they are using the term Eastern Turkestan. And if we go from Delhi to Xinjiang, Delhi to Kashgar, it is only 1 hour air travel. And if one has to come from Beijing to Kashgar, it will take him 6 hours by air. We can see that tilt of Eastern Turkestan towards Indian subcontinent as well as towards Central Asian countries, not towards Beijing. I have lived there. Even we have greater similarity, cultural similarity, dress similarity, and food similarity. That is why I am saying that Xinjiang is a colonial term. I have written it somewhere that Xinjiang is a colonial term used by China. That is how we have to perceive it. I think I have answered your question, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Wani.
Comment here for a moment. See the manner in which China has managed to keep Taiwan out of the Indian media till a few years ago was extremely successful. I must narrate a personal incident here. When I was in one of the many newspapers that I worked for, I carried an article on Taiwan, and my immediate boss rebuked me a lot. It was not as if he was promoting state policy. Later on, a very respected Indian professor of Chinese studies told me a lot of Indian editorial decision makers are taken care of by the Chinese embassy in some manner or the other. And lo and behold, about 6 months or a year later, this gentleman went on that Xinjiang, trip, not Xinjiang, what is it? That railway, that high-speed railway through Tibet. And then I got my answer. So Chinese media is extremely influential with its propaganda and misinformation and disinformation. Thank you.